The Life and Death of the Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy.
100 times she had been upon the point of telling her daughter, Elizabeth Jane, the true story of her life, the tragical crisis of which had been the transaction at Weydon Fair, when she was not much older than the girl now beside her. But she had refrained. An innocent maiden had thus grown up in the belief that the relations between the genial sailor and her mother were the ordinary ones that they had always appeared to be. But Susan Henchard's fear of losing her dearly loved daughter's heart by a revelation had little to do with any sense of wrongdoing on her own part. Her simplicity, the original ground of Henchard's contempt for her, had allowed her to live on in the conviction that Newson had acquired a morally real and justifiable right to her by his purchase, though the exact bearings and legal limits of that right were vague. The history of Susan Henchard's adventures in the interim can be told in 2 or 3 sentences. Absolutely helpless, she had been taken off to Canada, where they had lived several years without any great worldly success, though she worked as hard as any woman could to keep their cottage cheerful and well provided. When Elizabeth Jane was about 12 years old, the 3 returned to England and settled at Falmouth, where Newson made a living for a few years as boatman and general handy shoreman. He then engaged in the Newfoundland trade, and it was during this period that Susan had an awakening. A friend to whom she confided her history ridiculed her grave acceptance of her position, and all was over with her peace of mind. When Newson came home at the end of one winter, he saw that the delusion he had so carefully sustained had vanished forever. There was then a time of sadness, in which she told him her doubts if she could live with him longer. Newson left home again on the Newfoundland trade when the season came round. The vague news of his loss at sea a little later on solved a problem which had become torture to her meek conscience. She saw him no more. Of Henchard they heard nothing. Elizabeth Jane developed early into womanliness. One day, a month or so after receiving intelligence of Newson's death off the bank of Newfoundland, when the girl was about 18. The sight of the girl made her mother sad, not vaguely, but by logical inference. They both were still in that strait waistcoat of poverty from which she had tried so many times to be delivered for the girl's sake. The sailor, drowned or no, was probably now lost to them, and Susan's staunch, religious adherence to him as her husband in principle, till her views had been disturbed by enlightenment, was demanded no more. She asked herself whether the present moment, now that she was a free woman again, were not as opportune a one as she would find, in a world where everything had been so inopportune, for making a desperate effort to advance Elizabeth. At any rate, the propriety of returning to him, if he lived, was unquestionable. The awkwardness of searching for him lay in enlightening Elizabeth, a proceeding which her mother could not endure to contemplate. She finally resolved to undertake the search without confiding to the girl her former relations with Henchard, leaving it to him if they found him to take what steps he might choose to that end. This will account for their conversation at the fair, and the half-informed state in which Elizabeth was led onward. The strictest economy was indispensable. Sometimes they might have been seen on foot, sometimes on farmers' wagons, sometimes in carriers' vans, and thus they drew near to Casterbridge. Elizabeth Jane discovered to her alarm that her mother's health was not what it once had been, and there was ever and anon in her talk that renunciatory tone which showed that, but for the girl, she would not be very sorry to quit a life she was growing thoroughly weary of. It was on a Friday evening, near the middle of September, and just before dusk, that they reached the summit of a hill within a mile of the place they sought. The spot commanded a full view of the town and its environs. "What an old-fashioned place it seems to be," said Elizabeth Jane, while her silent mother mused on other things than topography. "It is huddled all together, and it is shut in by a square wall of trees, like a plot of garden ground by a box edging." Before they had risen to proceed, two men passed outside the hedge, engaged in argumentative conversation. "Why, surely," said Elizabeth, as they receded, "those men mentioned the name of Henchard in their talk, the name of our relative." "I thought so too," said Mrs. Newson. "That seems a hint to us that he is still here." "Yes. Shall I run after them, and ask them about him?" "No, no, no." As soon as they had wandered about, they could see that the stockade of gnarled trees which framed in Casterbridge was itself an avenue, standing on a low green bank or escarpment with a ditch yet visible without. Within the avenue and bank was a wall more or less discontinuous, and within the wall were packed the abodes of the burghers. They came to a grizzled church, whose massive square tower rose unbroken into the darkening sky, the lower parts being illuminated by the nearest lamps sufficiently to show how completely the mortar from the joints of the stonework had been nibbled out by time and weather, which had planted in the crevices, thus made little tufts of stonecrop and grass almost as far up as the very battlements. She carried a loaf under her arm, from which she was pulling pieces of bread and handing them to some other women who walked with her, which pieces they nibbled critically. "I've been a wife, and I've been a mother, and I never see such unprincipled bread in Casterbridge as this before, but you must be a real stranger here not to know what's made all the poor volks insides plim like blowed bladders this week." Not wishing to be observed further till she knew more of her future in this place, she withdrew with her daughter from the speaker's side.